Journalist in Japan died after working overtime for 159 hours in a month. The Miwa Sado took only 2 days as offs in the month leading to her death. The announcement comes a year after a similar ruling over the death of a young employee at the Dentsu advertising agency prompted a national debate over Japan's attitude to work-life balance and also amid calls to limit overtime in the country.
It's 4 a.m. in Tokyo. A 24-year-old woman sits alone in her apartment, phone in hand. She hasn't slept properly in weeks. Her body is shaking. She types out a message to a friend that reads, "I'm so tired." A few hours later, she clocks in, smiles, bows, says good morning to her co-workers like nothing is wrong. 9 months earlier, she had been excited to start this job in one of the most prestigious advertising agencies in the country, a dream position, the kind of job her parents bragged about to their friends. By Christmas, she would be dead. Her name was Matsuri Takahashi. She was 24 years old, and her death would expose something Japan had spent decades trying to keep behind closed doors. A culture so obsessed with appearing dedicated that it was quietly working its own people to death. There's a word for it. The Japanese came up with it because it kept happening over and over for 50 years. The word is Karoshi, which means death by overwork. This is the story of how that culture works and why so many people inside it can't escape it even when it's killing them. Matsuri Takahashi started working at the advertising giant named Dentsu in April of 2015. She was bright and ambitious, the kind of new hire a top firm wants. For the first few months of her working there, things seemed fine. Nothing was out of order. To understand what happened to her, we need to go back to the word karoshi, or death from overwork in English. Japan became known internationally for this term even before its economic bubble burst in the 1990s. In other words, this conversation about overwork is not new. Japan was having it decades before other countries started having similar ones. Today, people compare it to China's 996 culture, where workers are expected to work 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And they also compare it to crunch culture in American video game studios, where 100-hour weeks have been reported. But Japan was the one that named the phenomenon first, because Japan is where it had already been happening the longest. And it also had already happened at this exact company once before. In 1991, a 24-year-old Dentsu employee named Oshima Ichiro died by suicide. He was the same age Takahashi would be when she died. According to his family, he had originally been told to expect 60 to 80 hours of overtime a month. In reality, he was working so much, he would sometimes arrive home only to turn back around 2 hours later and return to the office. At one point, he was logging 147 hours of overtime in a single month. That works out to roughly 76-hour work weeks. So when Takahashi died 24 years later, it wasn't a one-time failure. It was the same company running the same pattern. A later investigation into her case found that Dentsu's managers had been pressuring employees to falsify their submitted hours, keeping the official numbers under 70 hours a month even when the real numbers were far higher. Despite that pressure to underreport, Japan's Labor Inspections Board still certified that Takahashi had worked at least 105 hours of overtime in a single month. That number was lower than what her own family believed was accurate, but it was still well past the legal limit. On December 25th, 2015, Christmas Day, Takahashi died by suicide. She sent her mother a final message. In it, she said, in essence, that both work and life had become unbearable, and thanked her mother for everything. Her death was officially ruled a workplace injury, with overwork named as the underlying cause. The backlash against Dentsu was immediate. company was branded a black company, a term used in Japan for firms that systematically abuse their staff. So how does a country end up building an entire corporate culture around this? Well, there is two everyday habits workers repeatedly experience that explain most of it. The first, it's called sanjo, which just means overtime culture. Here's a key thing to understand about it. It's rarely about whether there's actually more work left to do. Staying late at the office functions as a signal. It tells everyone around you that you're committed. Leaving early sends the opposite signal, even if your work is finished. So, in many Japanese offices, people stay simply because leaving looks bad, not because the job requires it. This often ends in workers spending hours seated at their desk with nothing to do, just watching time pass by or pretending to work so they can look busy. The second, it's called nomikai, which means after-work drinking sessions with co-workers and managers. Technically, these are optional, but in practice, they aren't. There's even a specific word for this dynamic, nominication, which combines the Japanese word for drinking and the English word communication. The reason that word exists is that so much real workplace bonding and even real decision-making happens at these drinking sessions instead of during actual office hours. This leaves workers having to be socially obligated to attend these events very often, extending their already long workday to late hours of the night and leaving very little time for activities that don't include work. Underneath both of those habits sits a deeper expectation, and it is that as a worker, you're simply not supposed to say out loud that you're struggling. You're expected to perform composure instead. This expectation explains something very specific about Takahashi's case. Why investigators had to dig through falsified spreadsheets just to learn what she had actually been working all of that overtime. Inside that culture, nobody was structurally allowed to just state the real number of hours they were working out loud, let alone admit what that number was doing to them. What happened after Takahashi's death is where the story gets more complicated because it shows both real progress and the limits of that progress. In a rare one-day trial, Dentsu's president admitted in court that the company had permitted illegal levels of overtime and that this directly contributed to Takahashi's death. That admission, which was reported by the Japan Times, was about as serious as a corporate acknowledgement of guilt can get. But under Japanese law, fines for labor violations like this are capped at low amounts by statute, regardless of how severe the consequences were. The law is written to punish the paperwork violation, which was exceeding legal overtime limits, not to account for a life lost because of it. So even with the company's own president admitting full responsibility for what happened, the trial was expected to result only in a small fine, and that's exactly what happened. The admission of guilt was total, but the legal consequence wasn't. Takahashi's mothers held a news conference in 2016 to lay out exactly what had happened to her daughter. In the years since, she has spoken at schools and labor unions to keep the issue from being forgotten. This past December would have been the family's 10th Christmas without her, and she said there's still something she can tell her daughter. She can't tell her that her death put an end to Karoshi and Japan, because it didn't. Takahashi's case became the direct catalyst for Japan's 2018 Work Style Reform Act, a law that capped overtime hours and guaranteed paid annual leave for the first time. It remains one of the most direct legislative responses to a single Karoshi case in the country's history. The limit to all of this progress is that according to recent reporting from Japan Today, that same legacy is now under threat. Japan's labor unions have pushed back against comments from Japan's Prime Minister, who has suggested she'd like to ease the very overtime restrictions that Takahashi's case helped create. Tomoko Yoshino, who leads Rengo, Japan's largest labor union federation, has said the current overtime cap is already close to the threshold researchers associate with a heightened risk of death, and that loosening it now would be unacceptable. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. Japan passed a law capping overtime hours, it fined a company for breaking it, and watched its president admit guilt in open court. All of that happened, but none of it touched the unwritten rule, the one that made it impossible for Takahashi to simply say out loud months before she died that she couldn't keep doing this. The law changed, but has the culture underneath it changed too? That's still an open question. It's a question her mother is still trying to answer for the public 10 years later, because almost nobody else is asking it.